Greetings, everyone, on this Trinity Sunday. We're here at St. Matthew's Church in Glendale, California, wrapping up our Bible study of the book of Mark, Mark's Gospel. Today we are at Mark chapter 16, which is Mark's very short resurrection account. And we'll see what Mark actually says about the resurrection and what he doesn't say. And then we'll take a brief look at some of the later additions, which you might find in some of your Bibles, of later scribes, later copyists adding a little bit to the story. But let's launch into Mark chapter 16. And Carolyn, would you read, please, verse 1?
And when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him.
So Nicodemus had already placed spices, John tells us, on the day of burial. It's interesting, we believe at this time that because of their time in Egypt, the Jews had become familiar with Egyptian mummification procedures, and so the Jews had learned a lot about embalming bodies from the Egyptians, but still they had their own practices that had developed by this point, which is 1200 years later. It was a reverential anointing of the body with spices. The spices would, in all reality, help to control the smell as the body decomposed over the course of a year. We've probably talked about before. Today, you would most find this probably more in Arab cultures. I remember some movie where they actually showed where a sheet is typically laid over the body, and then the women in the family scrub the dead body, kind of wash the body to prepare it for burial. With Jesus, things are very rushed, but they have placed him in with spices on Friday, but it was the Sabbath approaching, so they couldn't do much. So now that the Sabbath is over, the women are coming back now Sunday morning, and they're going to kind of complete the process that there wasn't time to do enough of on Friday, and more properly prepare the body for this year of lying on the shelf there in the tomb, while the body will then decompose and the bones will be placed in a box and pushed in a niche. Let's do verse 2, Judy D, please.
And very early on the first day of the week, they went to the tomb when the sun had risen.
So the sun is now going up. Luke tells us that it is early dawn. John says it's still dark, so it must be like that breaking moment that they start out, we would say first thing in the morning or at the crack of dawn, they're heading away. It's about 2 miles from Bethany, where they're most likely staying. Jesus' followers are probably in Bethany, some of them at this point, though they could be at the home of John Mark's mother. They're heading off to the tomb, which is this short distance. They're preparing for what's going on. It's early in the morning. You can imagine their emotions at this point. They're probably still greatly disturbed. They're in shock. They don't know what has really happened. They don't understand. Yes, we can look back with hindsight and see that Jesus has told them over and over that the Son of Man will rise on the third day. But at this moment, they're really not grasping any of that. They're just in horror, basically. Probably the most modern equivalent for us would be, think of a few days after the funeral service, going back to lay some flowers on the grave. You're still kind of upset, you're still kind of in shock, but you're going for that ceremonial or emotional touch to kind of pay our respects, we might say. These are women who are going to a tomb in that era where the stone would be in front of the tomb, so that's going to be a problem. They might be hoping that the Roman soldiers will open it for them. They're not exactly sure how they're going to do this, and so we hear that in verse 3. Dennis, please.
And they ask each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?
That verse shows us that they have no hope of a resurrection. They're not thinking of that whatsoever, because the only thing in their minds is there's a dead body in that tomb and there's a stone in front of the tomb, and how are we going to prepare these things? How are we going to open this back up so that we can properly prepare the body in a way that wasn't done? They're getting ready to prepare. They are observing the laws and the customs of that time. They're being very practical. They're being very sensible. in the midst of all of their grief, and they're wondering, well, we need to do this. This is proper to do, but how can we actually do it? Verse 4, Diane, please.
But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away.
It's kind of this looking up. It's almost like you can imagine how being truly depressed and sorrowful, you're tending to kind of look at the ground, and depression, your eyes are downcast, we might say. Some people have elaborated on this verse that it's kind of like they've got downcast eyes and heavy hearts. Picture that image in your minds. And as they're walking up the hill, now they see the stones rolled away. They don't really understand what that means. And we'll talk about why the stones rolled away. Verse 5. Mike, please.
A moment. But when they looked, they could see that the stone, I'm sorry, that's Diane's line. On entering the tomb, they saw a young man in a white robe seated on the right-hand side, and they were struck with amazement.
Good, good. So they see the stones rolled away. They decide to go inside. They enter the tomb, and Mark says they see a young man. Matthew says they see an angel. Luke says they see two men. Some point to these as discrepancies in the resurrection stories, as if somehow they're in conflict. In all reality, we would say that the fact that the details are slightly different tends to increase the veracity of the account. If this was all a made-up story and somebody was trying to sell a lie, as you made more copies and as you told the story, the one thing you'd want to do is get every detail exactly alike. It's kind of like how a lawyer might coach witnesses for court. Make sure you've got your stories straight. Or criminals, before they're going to talk to the police, let's make sure we've got our stories straight. What? That's what you want to do when you're selling a lie, is get your story straight. But the Gospels tell everything slightly different. It's very possible there are two messengers here. Mark focuses on one as he tells the story. Luke, speaking to a Greek audience, spells that out as angel. Pam and I started talking about that this morning a little bit. Remember, the word angel, angelos, simply means messenger. It's not overly clear what that means. So here is this young man, according to Mark, some sort of messenger of God who's in a white robe, and he's sitting there on the right side, and they were, my translation was amazed, right?
Struck with amazement.
Struck with amazement. What else do you have?
Alarmed.
Alarmed.
Alarmed. Affrighted.
Affrighted. Right. There's an older translation. They were affrighted. Yes. I mean, you can imagine all of a sudden you're going into what you think is an empty tomb, or, well, no, they don't think it's an empty tomb. They're walking into a tomb with the stone rolled away, which is curious. They're expecting to see a dead body, and instead there is this personage of some kind sitting there in a white robe, and he says, verse 6, are we at Carol?
And he saith unto them, Be not affrighted. Ye seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Behold the place where they laid him.
Don't be amazed. Why are you so amazed by this? Mark says Jesus the Nazarene. The other Gospels don't mention, but Mark gives this clear detail. This is the person. You're in the right grave. You found the headstone with the right name, but he's not here. The one who is crucified, a description which in that culture would be automatic shame. He who was crucified, that is something incredibly shameful. Not only is he dead, but he is shamed. He is now not only not ashamed, but he's crowned with glory. He is arisen again. He is not here. See the place where they have laid him. Now, wonderful news. We love hearing the story at Easter. Try to put yourself in the shoes, the sandals of these women at that moment. It has to be so mind-boggling. How do you wrap your head around what you're experiencing at that moment? Verse 7. Melissa, please.
Now go and tell his followers and Peter Jesus is going into Galilee. He will be there before you. You will see him there, as he told you before.
Go tell his disciples and
Peter.
why singled out
Peter.
there? Why singled out? Mark
To
tends to
comfort
be the
Peter?
gospel. Go ahead, Tracy. What?
To comfort Peter?
I think that's part. Mike, did you say something too?
Well, this is Mark's. This is Mark's writing of Peter's account.
So this is the gospel according to Mark, which is really the gospel according to Peter in a sense. It's Mark recording Peter's memories. And so I think Peter probably took special comfort in hearing this special word. I mean, Judas is gone at this point. Judas has already killed himself. Of the rest, they're all distraught, but Peter more so probably than the others because of his betrayal. And so this special word to Peter is something that stands out in Peter's mind, that he's risen. And Peter grasps this, and that is passed on then to Mark so that we find it here. It's a word of compassion and special comfort to Peter because Peter has probably been the most devastated. He's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you're going to see him again, just as he told you, in that same spot. He had told you to fish for people. In that same spot you had heard him teach. In that same spot now you're going to see him again. And Daniel will close us out with verse 8.
The women were shaking and confused. They went out and ran away from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
Thank you, Daniel.
Okay.
Sometimes we kind of shortcut and say, well, Mark doesn't really have a resurrection account. Well, yes, he does. He just doesn't really have post-resurrection appearances. This is where Mark ends it, but he ends it with the resurrection. The tomb is empty. The angel has said, young man, according to Mark, has said, he's not here. He's arisen, and you're going to see him in Galilee. And now they are trembling and bewildered. What other descriptions do you have? What other translations for trembling and bewildered?
Astonished.
Amazement.
And
Frightened out of
consternation.
their wits.
Frightened out of their wits. Oh, that's good. I like that. Matthew says they're filled with fear and great joy. That's interesting that Matthew tries to get both sides of the emotion, that there's something starting to percolate, but they're still just so filled with fear. How could they not be filled with fear? Can you imagine seeing this person sitting in the tomb and saying that he's risen? Maybe that joy is starting to creep in, but at this moment they are filled with fear, and they said nothing to anyone, Mark says us, because they were afraid. Right. Now, that's where Mark ends it. The women run in fear. They don't know what to say. They're just overcome, and that's where Mark ends the story. Now, Matthew and Luke go on to give us some post-resurrection appearances, as does John. Why do you think Mark just cuts it off here?
In mine, it has what I'll call the addendum. It has some extra verses too.
There's two other traditional endings, and we'll talk about those in a moment. Those are later additions. We're quite sure of that now. But those are different monks, different scribes over the years thought, well, we can't end it here. We need to fill in the details. So they took Matthew and Luke and tried to fill in the details. But I think Mark's got a very specific reason to end it here. Any thoughts on what it might be?
Well, is it because he wants to move on and tell the rest of the story?
You're on the right track. If the women run in fear and say nothing to anyone, then how does the story get told?
No.
How does the story get told?
Decide to tell other people.
That's what Mark is doing here. Remember, Mark's whole gospel is fast action. This is what's happening. This is happening. This is happening. This is happening. You have to go and tell the disciples because he's waiting ahead, but the women are filled with fear. So now the people who are hearing this, remember, they don't have written copies, most people, for many years. The people hear this gospel read, here, go and tell. And the women don't. So that means you now have to
Go and tell.
Go and tell. That's what Mark's doing. Mark's closing his gospel by telling everyone who hears it, now it's your job to go and tell the story because he's going on ahead of you and you're going to see him again. That, I think that's where most scholars would land, and I think that's the correct interpretation, that's why Mark cuts it off here. It's not that Mark doesn't know about post-resurrection appearances. Of course, he knows what happens after this. Mark is giving a directive to people who hear this story for the first time. Listen to the good news. Think of what you've heard. He's risen. He's going ahead of you. You've got to run and tell other people this great good news. Mark knows that the women ended up telling. We know Mary Magdalene. They go back and tell Peter and John. Mark certainly knows all that, but he doesn't tell us that part of the story because he wants this to be his great commission. Matthew will end with go and tell all nations, teaching everything that I've told you, baptizing all nations. Matthew tells us that this is Mark's great commission. Ended here, and now you have to go and tell. But as Judy noted, some monks over time didn't find that ending quite too satisfying. They wanted a little bit more details filled in. And think of it, for many of these people, they only had one copy. They had one gospel. So early copyists would have had maybe just Mark, and maybe they had access to Matthew or Luke, but they're making a copy of Mark possibly for someone who's only going to have the Gospel of Mark, and so they want to fill in the details for those who now may have only the Gospel of Mark. I remember evangelism stuff in the 70s. It was the Gospel of John. Do you ever remember churches just passed out the Gospel of John? So you'd have that one story. Think of that in the early church, that some churches now are just going to have the copy of Mark. And so the copyists want to give some more details. And so I'm going to read the two different traditional endings, which we know now are not from the original, but fill in details. So this is called the shorter ending of Mark, and it probably Mark's gospel came first, ends here. The first ending added is probably this ending. It says, and all that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterward Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. So at some point, couple hundred years later, maybe slightly less, a monk decided to add those few words. All that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. It kind of contradicts what Mark's got a deliberate ending in mind. The women don't say anything. He knows they did. This copy, this tradition says, well, yeah, they didn't say anything, but 5 minutes later they went and told Peter. In a sense, that's kind of what happened, but this is trying to fill that. So probably a number of years after that little ending, some other monk or group of monks decided, well, that's not really satisfying. Let's try to fill in more from what we know from Matthew and Luke. And so this is called the longer ending, and I'll read that now. And some of you may have it. Now, after he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went out and told those who had been with him while they were mourning and weeping. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. After this he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they were walking into the country, and they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Let's look at those 2 pieces. First, this ending talks about Mary Magdalene seeing him and telling them. What gospel does that come from? Do you hear it almost every Easter from John chapter? I just told you, I gave you an answer. John's the one who records. Yes.
We were guessing the chapter.
Yeah. So, whoever writes this longer ending apparently has access to the Gospel of John, so he ties in that little bit from John. And then, this is verses 12 and 13, after this he appeared in another form to two of them as they're walking in the country. What story is that referencing?
Road to Emmaus?
That's the road to
Emmaus.
Emmaus. So who's ever creating this ending probably has maybe not a written copy, but at least the tradition that Luke works from and the tradition that John works from. And now we get to verse 14. Later he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table, and he upbraided them for their lack of faith and stubbornness because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. Means he kind of chews them out for not believing. And he said to them, "Go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation." So this is coming from Luke, telling us the story of that night he appears to the disciples. This is the Luke tradition. The one who believes and is baptized will be saved, but the one who does not believe will be condemned. That is a verse which many, especially Lutherans, memorize in catechism. That verse, the one who believes and is baptized will be saved, but the one who does not believe will be condemned. That's not from Mark's gospel, even though we often teach it to children. We probably don't do it as much anymore. I know I memorized that as a kid. Remember, Mark never wrote that. Some monk came up with that later on. And these signs will accompany those who believe. By using my name, they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes in their hands. And if they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick and they will recover. So then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, was taken up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and proclaimed the good news everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by the signs that accompanied it. So now as we hear that, remember, we can look from the 21st century with our critical analysis, and we call it textual analysis, and say, well, yeah, you shouldn't have added to the text, and this gets confusing. But put yourself in 1st, 2nd, 3rd century where you're writing a copy of a gospel that this might be the only story they had. The monk who adds these things has the best of intentions to give them a few more details based on the other gospels. It's no great conspiracy. It's not something we would do in this day and age because we can pick this up at home and have the whole thing in front of us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Pastor, I've got some marginal notes, not footnotes from the Bible, but from a previous Bible study somewhere.
Okay.
And I have written that after some discussion, these may have been speaker outline notes with several endings telling, as we called it, the Paul Harvey version, the rest of the story. Adapted to different congregations, especially as different gifts were present.
That makes perfect sense. Perfect sense as they're trying to tell it. There's also some other little side verses which poke into different copies here and there. One says, they excuse themselves, saying, this age of lawlessness and unbelief is under Satan, who does not allow the truth and power of God to prevail over the unclean things of the Spirit. Therefore reveal your righteousness now. Thus they spoke to Christ, and Christ replied to them, the term of years of Satan's power has been fulfilled, but other terrible things draw near. And for those who have sinned, I was handed over to death, that they may return to the truth and sin no more, that they may inherit the spiritual, imperishable glory of righteousness that is in heaven. I think what Mike is citing there makes perfect sense. That as they're preparing their copies, somebody's going to actually be speaking. It's probably a bishop who's preaching on this text, makes some side notes, and over time that kind of gets worked into a copy. That last one I read especially, it's got a little bit of fire and brimstone. Some bishop was coming down one Sunday and probably wrote his notes on the margin, but over time it got added to somebody's copy, and all of a sudden the copy can't be distinguished from the notes. Does that understand that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and Mark ends, as you mentioned so abruptly. There's no, it's appropriate to discuss on Trinity Sunday. There's no Pentecost, there's no Holy Spirit coming yet. It's just at the tomb, bang.
Yep. And so you can imagine that if you were telling the story, you want to fill in the details.
Well, in particular, with version and the cut and dried details, it's really rather astounding what happened to Jesus and his followers from Thursday, Friday, Saturday through Sunday.
Oh.
And it had to be a surreal experience. I mean, they had the temple, the veil was rent, the earthquake, the stone is rolled away. I mean, how on earth? They've been with Jesus all this time, many of them, and they still didn't quite know what was going on. So it had to be a really difficult time in terms of, do we go and tell her or not, or have we, in our parlance, we'd say, have you had enough time to even process the information?
Very good.
Do you even know yet what happened? How do you feel? You know, all those things.
I think that's the reason for the appearances over the course of the 40 days is, you can imagine even, okay, so the tomb's empty. So he shows up Sunday evening behind locked doors and reach and touch and eat and, you know, give me some fish, all that stuff. You can imagine still waking up the next morning thinking, well, was that a dream? Did that really happen?
Exactly.
So he
Exactly.
reemphasizes it again, and he reemphasizes it again. And, you know, there are those more skeptical scholars who say, well, see, they're having this resurrection experience, that he doesn't really rise, but this is all kind of in their minds. I think that's the whole point of the multiple appearances, is to reinforce the fact that this has really happened. He's really here.
You know, I've got a note here from in my version, back in verse, I think 6, there's no need for alarm. Someone else had a different phrasing, but I've got a little note here, and I don't have my Hebrew with me, but I said in the Hebrew, it's more like stop being afraid. It's a real imperative command. And you've got these, there's no need for alarm. He will be back just as he told you. They were afraid. It's a repetition. It's like Mark is writing, I think it's kind of the bookend of the beginning, because what did the angel, in this case a young man in the robe, say to Mary and to the shepherds at the beginning of the story? Be not afraid. Don't worry. Don't be frightened. At the very end, the same admonition, the same calming assurance.
Calming assurance. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Hello.
Somebody.
That better be Jesus calling.
Calling for you and for me.
Well, that probably reminds us that it is 1 o'clock, so that's a good time to kick off. I think we're going to go to Philippians next, just do a shorter book of Paul after we've been in a gospel for so long. So next week we'll start into a short letter of Paul and do a little more theology in Philippians.
Did we finish this, Mark?
Yep, Dalton, sorry, while the car alarm, I went out there and saw you crawling around inside, so then I knew you were okay, but we finished Mark while you were on your way home, I'm sorry.
Okay.
So, but you'll be able to watch the recording on YouTube, which I'm going to end right now.
Yeah, thanks. I forgot
Thanks
about
to
that.
everyone who joined us on YouTube.